What's your creepiest non-paranormal story? 9th grade. My friends and I left campus for lunch and were walking through a neighborhood. My friend noticed up ahead on the other side of the street, some guy in a pickup truck was talking to a little girl right outside his front door with the front door open. He said something wasn't right, and I thought it must just be her father. Anyway, my friend walks up to him, my friends and me following, and asks if there's a problem. The older guy said no, leave him and his granddaughter alone. My friend asks her if that's her grandfather, and she said no. When he asked her if she knew him, she said no. That's when my friend John stepped in between them and started talking shit to him, threatening to kick his ass. My friend called the police. Police came. It got the neighbors' attention. Some guys across the street came out with baseball bats and chains when they saw what was going on. The police had to go and keep them from intervening, that the cops were taking care of it. The girl's mom came outside and was crying and screaming, which is what got the neighbors' attention besides the sirens. We had to write down a report for the officers, give our contact information, though they never contacted us. If we didn't decide to walk to lunch that day, this little girl could have been kidnapped, raped, and killed. When I was a little kid, like 8 or 9, I was walking down a pretty main street in Moscow with a friend of mine. I don't really remember where we were headed, but I was the type of kid that was always out and about. So we turned down a smaller street, and I see this guy. He was sort of sick looking, like his face was weird. He was standing in front of an open door, and it was really dark inside. He calls to me and says, "Could you please go inside and grab my glasses for me? I can't see without them." I look inside and all I could see is a table and a chair. So he tells me it's right there on the table. I was a little weirded out, plus the door was one of those thick metal doors, so it got me even more scared. So then I tell him, if you know where the glasses are, why can't you just get them yourself? And he tells me it's hard for him to see, so why don't I do it? At this point, I just walked away really fast. Sometimes I still think of that moment, and I think that I could have easily been raped or molested or killed that day. I live in a small cul-de-sac in the middle of nowhere. The next nearest neighborhood is over 4 miles away. One night a few years ago, we got over 1.5 feet of snow overnight. So far from the main roads, and on the weekend I knew our roads will be remained unplowed for quite some time. I went to my outback deck door to admire the snow-draped trees and the still heavily falling flurries when I noticed footprints leading to my door, then turning around and leaving. I looked and saw that they came from my neighbor's side and thought that one of their more delinquent kids played a joke as my sledding tube on the railing was popped. I decided I'd wait till later as it was early to call their parents. I went on Facebook, and after scrolling for a bit, I noticed one of my neighbors closer to the entrance posted, "Did someone knock for me or something at my back door?" We immediately called her and told her I have an idea. I called the first house on the entrance and told him what was going on. He went and checked, and sure enough, they were there too. Everyone started calling everyone else. I called the family at the far end, and they told me there was none there. Then I got a call from my next door neighbor. She called the woman that lives next door to the end house. She said that there were footprints that led to her door, but none led away. We already called the police by this point, but now we called them back and said it's an emergency now. They told us the roads are still all unplowed and they can't send a plow truck to clear the way as they are a privately owned company. The woman was losing it, so one of the husbands, huge bear of a man across the road from her, texted her to say he was coming over to invite her over. He came and she left. We put up one guy's live feed motion recording hunting cameras facing all exits. Nothing came out. Around 7 p.m., a plow truck came as well as 3 cop cars. The couple she was staying with and her went to her house and stood in the doorway as the police searched. They found nothing. She begged them to keep looking, so they did. 2 of the cops went into the basement again. This time only one came up. He took her to the side room, and we could hear her hysterical crying. By now, we are all out there. Me and a few other guys started towards the door when several police confronted us. They told us they found someone hiding under a cover opening in the stairwell that she didn't even know existed. A few minutes later, a scruffy man screaming and kicking came out in cuffs and was led away. In his little campout, they found blankets she'd just cleaned and put away. In the room next to hers, she stayed in other people's houses for a long time before going back. Even then, she wouldn't stay alone. She sold the house the next summer. He turned out to be a thrill-seeking junkie who was on probation for assault against a family member. The cops told us that they feel like he didn't want to stay at his apartment after a fight with his roommate and drove off in his roommate's car from the country over and got stuck on our unplowed roads. We all were called as witnesses in the case, and he took some electronics from her basement. Couldn't get him on that since he never left with the stuff. It was about 4 months of court, and that is why you always make sure you lock your doors. When I was around 13, my single father worked nights, and because of this, I was in charge of babysitting my 10-year-old sister. I was up at 3 a.m. on a school night in the living room watching TV. This is around the time I discovered the Girls Gone Wild commercials, when I hear a car pull in my driveway. Thinking it was my father, I did what any sensible child would do, and I turned off the TV and like a bolt of lightning ran to my room. As I waited pretending to be sleeping, I noticed that the vehicle never turned off, and so I mustered up some courage and peeked out my bedroom window. Outside, there was a truck I didn't recognize just sitting in the driveway with its headlights on. I heard the front doorknob jingle, and for whatever reason I grabbed a metal pole and ran into my sister's room, locked the door, and started hitting it, making it sound like a house alarm. I did this for what felt like an eternity, while my sister kept watch and saw 2 men get in their truck and drive off. They could have been lost. They could have been looking to rob us, who knows? But I never told my father for fear of being punished being up at 3 a.m. And I never saw anything like that again. When I was in college, I was stopped at a gas station putting air in my tires, and this man came over and started talking to me. It started off fine. It seemed he was just friendly and without much social finesse. But then, he continued to get closer to me and lean on my car. It is very difficult to explain, but I very much felt like I was in danger. There was no real way I could get into my car without trapping myself, and it just really seemed like he was intent on sticking around. My keys were also in the car because I was a 19-year-old Midwestern girl who still trusted the world. He also kept glancing toward the gas pumps, which I felt was a sign he was waiting for me to be alone. I know all the comments to this post will be, "You should have," but I felt very trapped by the situation. About 5 or 6 minutes into this, I locked eyes with a different guy, much older, across the parking lot. I tried to convey something is wrong as hard as possible, and he quickly walked inside the gas station. I felt like he was trying to avoid seeing something unpleasant, and I was going to end up alone. A minute later, the older guy comes out of the gas station with a few sodas and walks directly out to me and said something like, "Good thing you stopped. Your mom has been hinting about being thirsty for the last half hour. I got you a soda too while I was in. Now do you know how to get to some town name, or do you want to follow?" I replied that I'd better follow, because you know how I am with directions. So this accomplished 2 things. He gave me an out to the situation, and let the creepy guy know that someone was watching. So I followed him for about 3 miles out of town, at which point the guy just kind of waved like, "You're good," and I turned and went back to my dorm. I never got a chance to thank him in person, so every time I tell this story, I have to say a big thank you to anyone who has ever done anything like this. I've gotten 2 opportunities to step in and do something similar, both times pretending to be the BFF of a drunk girl because it looked like she was in a bad position. I wish I could tell that guy that I will now always get involved when someone looks like they are in trouble, because if I'm wrong, well then I look crazy / can be embarrassed, but if I'm right, I can basically save someone. A couple of months ago, my husband and I were road tripping across the USA. At 3 a.m., we stopped at a rundown gas station in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska. By the middle of nowhere, I mean the middle of nowhere. The gas station was the only building in the area, and it was surrounded by empty fields. It was maybe 2 miles off of the interstate. At 3 a.m. it was pitch black outside, and the lights at the gas station were the only thing that illuminated the area. Since the gas station was closed, we were the only people there. My husband filled up the Jeep, and we spent a few minutes rummaging through our bags because I couldn't find my purse. Turned out that I had left it in a relative's car in Chicago. Oops. After a while, an SUV pulled up right next to us. The driver was a white man in his late 20s or early 30s. At that point, I was sitting in the passenger seat, and my husband was about to get into the driver's seat. The man approached my husband and said, "I lost my iPhone here. Have you seen it?" Suddenly, a sense of dread filled the pit of my stomach as I noticed that he already had a phone, a flip phone on his hip. I studied his face. While he looked unassuming, there was something off about him, something sinister. "I must have left it in that field over there," he said. "The field was pitch black. Can you help me look for it?" My husband already had his iPhone out with the flashlight on. He's such a good Samaritan. He started to follow the man. I whipped out my phone and texted him, "Leave." My husband immediately saw the text and looked at me. I must have looked terrified because he ran, jumped into the car, and we booked it out of there. As we were leaving, I looked back and saw the man get into his car. We drove for about 20 miles on the interstate to a rest stop and slept there. After a short time, my husband woke me up and told me to look through the passenger side window. The man had pulled up right next to us. There were some empty parking spaces at the rest stop and still parked next to us. The creepy part is that we had been parked at the very end of the rest stop, and the spot next to us wasn't a parking space. We had our seats down to help us sleep, so he probably didn't see us in the Jeep. We quietly watched him get out of his car, look over our Jeep, and walk into the building, probably looking for us. As soon as he entered the building, we snapped our seats back up and hauled ass out of there. We drove for about 50 miles and found a hotel about 6 miles north of the interstate. We never saw him again. You might call my husband naive, but in his defense, he had just lost his last living parent unexpectedly. We were on our way home from the funeral, so he wasn't all there at the moment. I was at home alone, about 18 years old at the time. I had seriously bad agoraphobia at the time. I would keep all my blinds shut and everything locked up tight. I also had a tendency to avoid answering the door if someone knocked. It was mid-afternoon, and a knock came at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so was instantly on guard. I decided not to answer and ignore it, but they kept knocking. It was giving me really bad anxiety. Then they started trying to open the door, just turning the knob as it was locked. This went on for about 20 minutes. Them still knocking and trying to get in, so I finally answered the door. I kept the screen door locked though. There was a very disheveled, homeless-looking man there, big scraggly beard, long, knotty, wild hair, dirty clothes. He asked if he could come in and stare at me. I said no, sorry, and shut the door. Then he started yelling out, pretty girl, come back, let me in, just let me look at you." Continued knocking and trying to get in. I had no phone on me at the time. I couldn't call the police. I was terrified. Eventually my boyfriend came home and found him standing on our porch. He asked my boyfriend if he could come inside and look at the pretty girl. My boyfriend told him to go away or he would call the police, but he still wouldn't leave. Boyfriend called the police and they came and took him away and talked to him. Police came back and told us he was actually our neighbor whose brother had passed away recently and he had gone completely off the rails and had been binge drinking every day and not leaving his flat. We didn't recognize him because he was so messy and dirty looking, like a wild man. My brother was selling some of his old laptop stuff on Craigslist. He got an email from a middle-aged woman inquiring about the laptop. They eventually agreed on a price, and she asked him to meet her behind a nearby farm fresh. A neighborhood was behind the building. They were only separated by a chain-link fence. My brother got slightly suspicious, but not enough to back out of the deal. When it was time to meet up, my brother didn't park behind the farm fresh, but in the neighborhood with a good 50 yards between him and the fence. There was only one car parked behind the building, but the windows were too tinted to see into from there. While still in the car, he texted her that he was at the discussed location. She texted that she couldn't see him, so he said that he was right around the side of the store and to get out and meet him. Then, all the car doors opened, and 5 thuggish teenagers came out, one of which was carrying a baseball bat, and walked to where my brother said he was. No woman with them at all. A minute later, the same woman texted back saying that she still couldn't find him. Needless to say, the deal was off. I lived in a rural area, mountains and woods around the premises. Anyways, I used to smoke outside on this slab concrete type thing on the side of the house. I was standing under a dim outdoor porch light, which lit about 20 feet around the area, so not very far. It was late at night, just me and my baby home, but my baby was sleeping. Not even halfway into my cig, I heard a deep growling noise, and it slowly got closer and closer and louder as it did. When I first heard it, my reaction was to freeze. Didn't want to make eye contact with anything, so I don't even know how close it got. I just know it wasn't in front of me, but next to me. How close, I don't know. Didn't want to make a slow, sudden movement either, so I flicked my cig into the distance and jumped into the house, slammed and locked the door. Made a plan that I'd tip over this large wooden cabinet in front of the door if something tried getting in. Waited a few minutes in case whatever it was tried busting through, then looked out the windows around the residence and didn't see anything. Assumed it was a bear. Another time, same residence heard numerous 4, maybe 5 slams on the back door. Slowly crept to the door and tried looking outside without being obvious, though the lights were off back there. But then I heard some thuds on the roof above me. I called the police. They came out within 10 minutes or so. They searched the area and said they didn't see anything suspicious, and it could have been a bear. So yeah, but it doesn't explain the roof thuds.